Welcome to the Queer Conversation podcast, brought to you by Lottel Media, a show where we discuss all things queer. I am your host, Silke Bader, a publisher and producer in the LGBTQI space in Australia for the past 30 years. Hannah Malarski is back after two acclaimed sold-out seasons at Melbourne Fringe and Melbourne International Comedy Festival. BIG DYKE ENERGY returns for Pride Fest at a loading dock theatre Qtopia, Sydney. Part stand-up, sketch show and exorcism, BIG DYKE ENERGY is a riotous journey about being our best queer self in a culture intent on bringing out the worst in you. A comedy about the power of story and the dangers of our cultural omissions. For Hannah, it's been a long and tiring journey from coming out to the even lengthier process of healing the destructive shame that follows her around. Welcome to Queer Conversation. I'm just going to have a chat about you as a writer and performer in the comedy space. Is that the right way of describing you?
I guess so, yeah. I guess comedy's the genre that I deal in, but it's I do sort of make performances for theatre and for the internet. So I guess, yeah, let's say in the comedy space. I moved from Tassie, from Hobart, down the bottom, in 2011 to study playwriting in Sydney. And then I moved from Sydney to Melbourne to get involved in the independent theatre scene. So I moved to Melbourne just to basically make work and practice my craft. And then I moved back to Sydney in the past 3 years after lockdowns came in, and yeah, I've just been creating work in Sydney since then.
Were you for lockdown in Sydney or Melbourne?
I was in lockdown in Melbourne. I was there for the big two lockdowns.
Oh,
yeah, that was fun.
That was fun, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, a lot of artists were very creative throughout that time.
Yeah, I actually, every time there was a lockdown, I felt this relief. Wow. Well, because I was basically able to just dive into writing and making work at home and getting creative and finding like little DIY, cheapo kind of solutions to creating art, which was quite liberating actually.
So from writing to performing, is that a big leap?
I actually started out as a performer. That was my, always wanted to be a performer and actor. And I discovered in high school, I was always very quiet. I was a very quiet kid. And then I had my first drama class in year 7 and I discovered that I could make people laugh. And that really brought me out of my shell. And of course, at the same time, I was a closeted lesbian. And so that for me, it was sort of twofold. It was like this, almost like this sort of superpower, but also a bit of a shield, because if I could make people laugh, it would stop people from looking closer at me. So there's a sort of a double-edged thing with comedy for me, where it sort of started out almost as like a safety net sort of thing.
Your next show, the title, BIG DYKE ENERGY. How did you come up with the title? What does it represent? And what can viewers expect?
Big Dick Energy was this way to describe men who had this certain power, this energy walking into a room where it would be as if they had a large penis, which is a bit, the logic behind that's a little flawed. But anyway, I heard Big Dyke Energy as an alternative to that power that certain lesbians have when they walk into a room. And it's this sort of almost indescribable energy, or, this... It's a person who is so comfortable within themselves and they're so grounded, and they don't even have to speak, but they just ooze this kind of confidence and groundedness. And I really found that quite fascinating. I came out about 12 years ago, and I thought when I was going to come out, that would be it. I would be done, like I would be finished. The shame would just melt away, and I would be fully self-actualized. Or that's what I hoped would happen, that I was under this sort of misapprehension that you would come out and that you'd be done with the whole journey. But then I started writing this show, and I started with the title because I found the title really almost like I found it funny, I found it evocative, but I also found it confronting because of my relationship to the word dyke. I think for me, the word dyke had always felt like a bit of a weapon that had been used against, lesbians in the community. But on the flip side, there was also a whole section of the community who had been embracing the term dyke. They had, basically they had embraced the term as a term of power, and they had reinvented this word. So I really wanted to explore that.
The word dyke, in my understanding, has been embraced by the older generation. They call themselves, I'm not a lesbian, I'm a dyke.
Yeah, right.
And they wear it proudly. You hardly hear that anymore in today's world. Like the younger ones, they don't call themselves lesbians or dykes or anything. If anything, it's non-binary. Who claims the word dyke?
Well, it does pop up a lot with, we'll say, dykes on bikes. And it is a term that it's sort of started to go out of, like you said, out of fashion. But it's something that I grew up hearing in Tasmania, dyke, she's a effing dyke, So it's certainly part of my experience to hear dyke in mostly a derogatory way. And I actually looked into a lot of the history of lesbian history, particularly in Australia, and with, dykes on bikes and early Mardi Gras and the way that the lesbians showed up during the AIDS crisis and all of that. And I found it so inspiring, these women, these people who just showed up and who showed up for the community and who represented this very particular form of strength. That I often hear the term, we're equal but we're not the same. And I think that's completely true in the way that, the lesbians demonstrated and they showed up, but they showed up with their whole selves, regardless of who they were, what mistakes they'd made. And that's really what the show is about. Big Dyke Energy is a theatre show and it's a comedy, and I like to call it a bit of a lesbian Trojan horse. It's a series of interconnected scenes. There's sketches, there are songs. There is also a lesbian mating ritual in it, because I really wanted to address this question that I'm often asked, which is, how do you lesbians do it? I've been asked that a lot of times in my life, so I thought, why don't we answer it on stage theatrically? So it's this series of scenes and sketches and moments which all explore this central idea of how do we embrace becoming our most powerful, unbridled lesbian superhero selves, and how do we unleash our big dyke energy? So it's kind of like, I like to say, theatrical stand-up. And I'm in the show, but also I've brought in my partner. So my partner Ash is in the show for a very specific reason, which I won't spoil. So I've got them involved. They're in the show for about a third of it, because they were originally an actor, and they basically, the way we met was I'd seen a bunch of shows that they were involved in. Basically, they knew me as their biggest fan. So I'd always wanted to put them in a show because they're just this extraordinary actor, and finally got them in the show, and they were basically kicking and screaming. They were like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And then come opening night, they were like, I love it. They were like, yeah, everyone's applauding them. They're absolutely phenomenal in the show. So it's me and my partner in the show, but it's mostly me in the show for the majority of it. What really inspired me was, I heard this quote once, which was, the world is not made up of atoms, but of stories. Our reality is the stories that we believe. And that quote was part of what inspired me with the writing of this show as well. That was another sort of North Star when writing the show. And what I think that means is that we're surrounded by stories, and particularly with, our queer community has a lot of stories that are missing about us. And there are stories told about us through the media, and there's also stories told about us through history, and there are huge amounts of our history missing. And I feel like that's been quite a damaging thing for us, and it's really important that we tell the whole story. I remember watching this movie really recently. I don't know if you heard of it. It's called Bottoms, and it's about these two high school students. And it was the first time that I'd seen a different side of a queer character represented in a film, where they were allowed to be these like horny losers on screen, but to still be redeemable by the end. And that kind of blew my mind, because that was this year that I watched that and I saw this representation of messy queers in the media, of our mess, of our flaws. I realised, I noticed looking at lesbians throughout the recent Australian history, in fighting for our rights, you know, legalising being gay even in Australia, was that they weren't trying to be obedient and they weren't trying to be acceptable. You know, they weren't trying to blend in or, you know, play by the rules. They just showed up. They were indigestible. They didn't apologise for who they were. They were their whole selves. And I found that really, really inspiring. And so there's this parallel journey throughout the show where there's the echoes of history, of lesbian history and queer history, and then there's my own personal history woven through the show. So there is, in the show, and this is going to sound like, what? But in the show, I basically systematically destroy my reputation by talking about at the time that I catfished my ex. There's also a scene where I talk about how to deal with homophobia. There's a lesbian mating dance. There is music. I've described it almost like a variety show, but with a through line. Yeah, a very, very lesbian variety show. So it is on at Qtopia, which is Sydney's first queer museum, which is very exciting. It's just outside Taylor Square, just on Oxford Street in Darlinghurst. And that is going to be on the 11th, the 12th and 13th of June at 6:30.
Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about your next show. Is there anything else that you are working on that we should be looking out for?
Well, I'd really love people to check out my work online, because that's something that I'm constantly creating is videos on through social media pages. So there may be some announcements coming up, some new shows. Yeah, so that's going to be the best way of seeing what's coming.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you would like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, or Facebook using the tag @LottleMedia, or head over to our website lotl.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.